Welcome. So today we're going to tackle one of the biggest challenges in all of communication. How do we figure out what a text really means?
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the core problem of understanding itself. Then, we'll meet the philosopher who basically made his life's mission to solve it. From there, we'll dive into his most famous idea, this thing called the hermeneutics circle, and get into his practical formula for interpretation. And get this, we're even going to tackle his wild claim that we can understand an author better than they understood themselves, before wrapping it all up with his incredible legacy.
I mean, we've all been there, right? You get a one-word reply or a message without an emoji, and suddenly your mind is just spinning, trying to figure out what they really mean. Well, that gap, that space between the words on the page and the intended meaning, that's exactly the problem we're digging into today.
Well, the person who took that exact feeling of confusion and decided to turn it into a systematic science was the German philosopher Friedrich Schleiermacher. He wanted to create a universal method for cracking the code of any text, not just a confusing message. He called this method hermeneutics. Now, I know, that's a big, fancy word, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. It's not about guessing. It's about having a structured, almost scientific approach to interpretation, whether you're reading ancient scripture, a legal document, or even that confusing text message.
So, Schleiermacher was working way back at the turn of the 19th century, and his idea was totally revolutionary for the time. He basically flipped the script. He argued that misunderstanding is our default setting, and we have to actively work to achieve understanding. It's a principle that would go on to shape how we think about language and meaning for the next 200 years.
So how do we start doing that work? Well, this brings us to Schleiermacher's most famous and, let's be honest, at first glance, his most paradoxical idea, the hermeneutics circle. In his own words, it's a circle where you can only understand the part through the whole, and the whole through the part. Okay, so that sounds like an impossible trap, a real chicken and egg problem. So what on earth does that actually mean in practice? Let's break it down. Think about a single word in a sentence. To really grasp its specific meaning, its nuance, its role, you have to understand the context of the whole sentence it's in. The word run, for example, means something totally different in I'm going for a run versus my nose has started to run.
But here's the circle. How can you possibly understand the whole sentence if you don't first understand the individual words that make it up? It feels like you're stuck, right?
But for Schleiermacher, this isn't a trap, it's a spiral. You start with a guess, a provisional understanding. You take a rough stab at the whole sentence's meaning, then use that to re-examine the individual words. Then you use your refined understanding of the words to improve your sense of the whole. You just bounce back and forth, and with each loop, your understanding gets sharper and sharper.
Okay, so if interpretation is this continuous loop, how do we make progress? Schleiermacher didn't just give us a cool theory. He gave us a practical toolkit. He developed a 4-part formula to guide us through that circle.
He broke it down into 4 reconstructions. First is the objective historical. You look at the text within the language of its time. Second, the objective divinatory, which is a bit of a leap. You consider how this text might actually change the language for the future. Then you pivot to the author. Third, the subjective historical. You reconstruct what was going on in the author's mind. And finally, the subjective divinatory. You try to understand how the act of writing itself changed the author. It's an incredibly thorough approach covering every possible angle.
Now this is where it gets really interesting. Where does all this work actually lead? Schleiermacher sets a goal for hermeneutics that is, frankly, totally audacious and completely mind-bending.
I mean, after all this analysis, after circling between the part and the whole, after examining the text through this 4-part lens, what are we actually trying to achieve here?
There it is. The goal is not just to understand what the author understood. The goal is to understand the text better than the author did. I know that sounds impossibly arrogant, right? How could we possibly know more about a text than the person who actually wrote it?
Well, Schleiermacher's logic is fascinating. The author's understanding is immediate and intuitive. They're in it. But our knowledge is mediated. We have distance. We can see the historical forces, the linguistic patterns, and the psychological influences that shaped the text in ways the author themselves might have been completely unaware of. We can make conscious what was unconscious for them.
And this set of ideas wasn't just some dusty academic theory. No way. It created ripples that completely changed the course of modern thought, from philosophy and literary criticism to law and theology.
So,
What are the big takeaways? These are the core principles. That language isn't static. It's shaped by history, that context, the author's life, their other works, the era they lived in, is everything. That you, the reader, aren't just a passive recipient, but an active participant in creating meaning. And that all our knowledge is a work in progress, constantly being refined in that hermeneutic circle.
And you can literally see the impact right here. From Dilthey, who applied these ideas to the human sciences, to Heidegger and Gadamer, who deepened the philosophical implications, all the way to postmodern thinkers like Derrida and Rorty, who questioned the very possibility of a single true interpretation. They all stand on Schleiermacher's shoulders.
So, the next time you encounter a text that feels confusing or complex, be it a classic novel, a historical document, or even just that puzzling email, remember Schleiermacher's tools. Think about the circle. Think about the context. The question is, now that you know the method, what will you go back and understand, perhaps even better than the person who wrote it?